Eco-activist Tzeporah Berman is an environmentalist who is determined to convince us to get serious about climate issues we can solve but don't. Her lifetime of resistance began in a BC forest. She continues to make noise and stand up for Mother Earth as the Climate and Energy Co-Director of Greenpeace International. She is the founder of Forest Ethics and Power Up Canada. Her first book, memoir, is called This Crazy Time. It is my pleasure to welcome Tzeporah Berman back to BC and back to Studio 4 to tell us more.
Thanks, Fanny.
Nice to see you again.
It's nice to be back.
How's Amsterdam?
It's incredible. It was an incredible experience living there in the last year. We moved our whole family there, the kids too, and
Forrest and
Quinn.
And
we lived there for an entire year without a car, all four of us on bikes, and it's an incredible. It's a very livable city. Mm-hmm. It was a great experience, and working for Greenpeace International. Greenpeace is a very different place today than it was when I worked there 10 years ago, and it's auspicious that we're talking about it today because today is Greenpeace's 40th anniversary. Mm. And now the fastest growing offices are in China, in India, and South Africa, and Greenpeace has climate and energy campaigns in 40 countries around the world. So I've learned a lot.
Why did you pick Greenpeace, or did Greenpeace pick you?
A little of both. I was incredibly depressed after the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen. And we had failed to reach a global deal. And the result is that we have not stemmed the rising tide of global warming pollution, and we are now seeing the consequences. 1 million people this year in Sudan who are displaced because of flooding. There are increased numbers around the world of people who don't have access to clean water now. The rising increase in storms. Actually just read this morning that more people died this year in the US as a result of tornadoes than in the last 10 years. So we're seeing it, and I got really depressed and trying to figure out what should I be doing now. And right at that time, friends from Greenpeace contacted me and said they were looking for a new co-director. And all of a sudden I thought, here I am speaking and telling people it's time to stand up and do everything you can, and it was time for me to leap off my cozy island. I was living on Cortez.
That's cozy.
Yeah, and so we moved to Amsterdam, and I started this job.
Take me back to your beginnings in the environmental movement. I think you said something like, I want to volunteer in the rainforest, sign me up, I cook.
That's right. And I cooked for a summer and helped build trails in the Walburn Valley on Vancouver Island, working with the Western Canada Wilderness Committee. I was 22, I think, when I started. I arrived in BC with a backpack and $200 in my pocket. I didn't know a single person, and I wanted to see the rainforests. And I fell in love with BC's forests. And the summer after that, I came back, and the area that we'd been studying, we'd been doing marbled murrelet studies in, it's an endangered seabird. We'd found evidence of it, that it was dependent on the old growth, and the whole area had been clear-cut logged. And I was devastated. And that's when I decided, I heard about protests up in Clayoquot Sound, that the local community was protesting logging, and I decided to join them. And that was the start of my crazy ride.
And how much did you know about protesting, campaigning, getting the message out at that time?
Nothing.
Pretty much.
I mean, that's part of why I wrote this book. I mean, I was a university student who loved the forests, and I didn't really know what campaigning meant. And I learned by trial and error over the last 20 years, and I've had some tremendous successes, some pretty spectacular failures. And in the book, I really write about that. I write about what worked and what didn't, because you can get a degree to become a doctor or a lawyer. You can't get a degree to become an environmental activist. And what I'm finding is that more and more is that people care, not just the people who are all day long professional activists, but everyone cares. Everyone knows we need to make a difference. But I'm a mom. You pack your kid's lunchbox and you get them ready for school the next day, and then you maybe have half an hour to think about these issues. So what do you actually do? And that's what I explore in this book.
And an informed environmental activist is a powerful environmental activist, an activist that knows about science, that knows about heart, that puts it all together.
Yeah.
No question. You're also an activist who believes in dialogue. Did you always?
No, I don't think so. I think when I started this work, at 23, it was all pretty clear to me. There were good guys and there were bad guys. The bad guys were logging, the good guys were us. And we had to stop the bad guys. It was pretty black and white. And what I found eventually surprised me. Some of my strongest allies, some of the people that I have worked closest with to craft solutions are now in government and industry. And what I realized over the last 20 years, maybe seems like common sense to you, but is that there really are good people everywhere. And that doesn't mean that we're just going to sit down and solve it over lunch, because most of the time for the big issues, we're not, like the tar sands today, or like logging in Clayoquot 20 years ago. And so we still need protests. We still need civil disobedience. I actually think we need it now more than ever. But we also have to be willing to sit down and work out solutions, because campaigns aren't an end in and of themselves. They're a way to get to an end.
And you have been in some interesting conferences, one with the First Nations leaders many moons ago, and I recall you were crying a lot in that particular meeting with the chiefs.
I talk a lot about that in this book, because these are really difficult issues. There's no black and white. And I think for a lot of social activists or environmental activists, we romanticize First Nations issues and First Nations beliefs to a great extent. And First Nations communities are people. There are people with different opinions. And what I came up against as a young activist was First Nations leaders who we really agreed with, and we shared their values and wanted to work with us, and many who wanted to log, and they wanted to do commercial logging. And we didn't agree with them.
And they needed jobs.
Well, exactly. And so the hard question is, if you support First Nations sovereignty, and if you believe that First Nations leaders should be, First Nations communities should be treated as governments, as sovereign governments, does that mean you have to agree with them all the time? So in that particular story, I talk about sitting with 13 chiefs who were all yelling at me. They were angry at Greenpeace because they needed the jobs that the logging companies were going to provide. And we eventually worked it out, and I actually sent some of the chiefs my book before it was published and said, I'm going to tell these stories. Are you okay with it? And did I reflect it properly?
And today you're not against logging or harvesting wood, timber, trees. You just want it done right.
Right. Well, there's a right way to do it, and there's also a right place. What we were arguing for then, and many people are still campaigning for around the country, is to ensure greater protected areas, and then outside of those protected areas, a different way to log, selective logging instead of clear-cut logging.
Speaking of greater protected areas, 5 million acres, the Great Bear Rainforest. Tell me about that, how it all came together finally.
Well, when we started the campaign, there were 359 valleys that were once on the west coast of Canada. When we started the campaign in '95, there were only 69 left. And all of those were slated to be logged in the next 5 to 10 years. And the campaign itself, the area itself on all the maps was just called the Mid-Coast Timber Supply Area. So I talk in the book about one of the smartest campaigning things we ever did, which was to rename it the Great Bear Rainforest, so people could see in their heads what an important place it is. So we captured people's imagination.
Some private land, some public land, a little bit of both?
It's the majority is public land.
Mostly government.
But what we did is we went to customers around the world and said, you need to help us. You need to use your influence to help protect this incredible place and demand different logging practices. We didn't say no one should be buying from BC. We said the products coming from BC should be ecologically responsible. And we ran campaigns against Staples, against Home Depot in the United States. And those companies eventually turned around and sat down and negotiated with us and the government and the industry and First Nations. And we were able to reach a landmark agreement to protect 5 million acres of rainforest and to ensure ecosystem-based management outside of that. So better logging practices and conservation finance for local communities.
And you ran a campaign taking a pretty good shot at Victoria's Secret.
We did.
Well, under your forest ethics hat.
That's right. That was one of Forest Ethics' big campaigns, and that was actually on the boreal forest, because what we found out is that Victoria's Secret was creating 1 million catalogs a day, and they were printing them on Canadian old-growth boreal forest. And so we approached Victoria's Secret, and they said, well, too bad, it's cheap paper, and we want to buy it, and it's not our problem, go talk to the government. And we ended up launching a campaign, which was, I think, the funnest campaign I've ever run. I mean, we had people in lingerie carrying chainsaws in front of Victoria's Secret stores across the United States. We did 888, I think, protests in 2 years.
That's effective. Turning chainsaws on or just carrying chainsaws?
They were cardboard.
Okay, that's good to know because chainsaws are heavy and stinky, as you know. So any lawsuits over that? What happened in the end?
Victoria's Secret became the first catalog company in the world to commit to an environmental procurement policy where they were committing to use recycled paper, to reduce their number of catalogs, to use Forest Stewardship Council certified paper. And they also announced, much to the dismay of boreal logging companies, that they would no longer buy any paper that came from endangered species habitat. And that created a conversation in Canada which resulted in the landmark Boreal Agreement, which is an agreement where now First Nations and environmental groups and industry are coming together across the country and identifying endangered species habitat and setting it aside.
And as companies compete so well, other companies follow suit.
Absolutely. And so we saw that tipping point with the catalog companies, more and more catalog companies committing to use ecologically responsible paper in the same way that we did as soon as Staples shifted, Office Depot wanted to shift. And over the last 20 years, we've changed the way that paper's made in North America.
Tzeporah Berman, our guest, This Crazy Time Living Our Environmental Challenge, her first book. With Mark Liren Young. We'll talk about that when we come back.